Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. Today, we're going to be doing an episode based in the canon of the Old Testament. One of the discussions at the history of our church, looking at even statements from Calvin and Luther, which we'll look at in a minute, there was some discrepancy about one of our Old Testament books, the Book of Esther. Now, what needs to be noted about the discrepancy is there wasn't a large amount of it very, very early on as much as there was later in history. And that deals with the idea because of some of the controversy around its text, its transmission, its distribution. And we're going to get into why that is, because there actually are different versions, if you would, of the story of Esther, as we can start comparing the Hebrew version of Esther, or even looking at the Septuagint version of Esther, or some of the other fragmented texts that we have that survived antiquity, looking at what recension of Esther is correct. So there's a lot of controversy just in its distribution and its copying, but as it relates to actually believing in its canonicity is only question one. Does it belong in the canon? The second question is, what recension is the correct? What I want to do over the next few really weeks is deal more in some of the canon. You know, I was telling a friend recently, I've really begun to miss doing some of the canon talks. I actually had a discussion about Bel and the dragon and even the story of Susanna, which really ignited some of the passion that I always have. And majorly, I did most of my research and doctoral work in canonicity, especially in the New Testament, just looking at the Gospels compared to the Gnostic Gospels. But one of the things I've always enjoyed is even Old Testament canon, which is much more difficult to deal in than the New. These are major talking points that are not happening in scholarship. There's maybe a handful of guys that are doing a good job of having these discussions, like Dr. John Mead from Phoenix Theological Seminary. He's one of the few that I know that actually touches this. A lot of people pride themselves in Dr. Kruger at RTS, who does a decent job of handling canon issues for the New Testament. But as it has been pointed out to him multiple times, and I've written against this, Dr. Mead has written against this, his criteria for canon does not work in the Old Testament. And it, specifically in places like this, where we get into the book of Esther, and you have to answer the question beyond the scope of, does Esther belong in canon? And the criteria, like for Dr. Kruger, and I don't mean to pick on him, he's a wonderful man, does a tremendous job. But looking at his criteria of canon, his threefold self-authenticating text, it doesn't defend Esther from two fronts. One, from the criteria of divine attributes of God in the text, because we're going to see that in a minute. Second thing it fails to do is to prove which one is the proper text, which one is the correct recension that we're supposed to be using, because what we're going to see in a minute is some of the earliest patristics had a version of Esther and quoted from it very early on. I mean, late first century into the early second century. And it's not the one that most of us would think or even want it to be. So these discussions have two lines of thinking in it. Does it belong in the text, the canon itself? And which text of the canon do we call canonical form of Esther? And I want to discuss that today. Now, I wrote an article on this a long time ago. Oh, I don't know, 3 years ago, maybe. It might even be, time is slipping. And what I thought was last year is actually 5 years ago. So I think it was about 2, 3, 4 years, somewhere in there ago. And I talked about really which version of Esther is there. I even asked the question, will the real Esther please stand up? Because there are debates that happen yet in smaller pockets in corners of the room, not necessarily in full-fledged widespread academia, although I think it should. I think that we need to start having these discussions more, especially as new discoveries take place. And I understand why the New Testament has precedence in these discussions for textual criticism and canonicity, and they should, because a lot of our faith is hinging on particularly, did Jesus actually do this? Did Jesus actually say this? Did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And we're looking for the evidence within the texts themselves, which is built out from them really citation and even allusion back from the earliest patristics and how they viewed things from their perspective and what they were taught from their successors. These things are necessary, and no one would dispute why we need to be engaging the New Testament canon and text issue. But we're getting to a point where we've exhausted it, and we've demonstrated the reliability of the Gospels, the reliability of the New Testament, the reliability of its claims, reliability of its miracles, the reliability of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I know there will always be pushback on that, but the greater of the scholars in the Christian world have risen to the occasion, and we have answered. They have answered. Individuals have answered. Groups have answered. Collaborative works have answered these very issues over and over and over again. But as a result of that, now the door is open to say, now we need to go further. Now the Old Testament is under attack. The Old Testament claim is under attack. And everything from the mysticists who are saying, oh, no, this is all stolen from mythology. Now we have to engage it, not just at a New Testament level. So these things are necessary for us to even have a discussion on programs like this. Now, overall, if you break it down, you could subsection this really, but there's really three main versions or recensions of Esther if you bring it all together. There's some nuance to it in some fragmented senses, but overall, there's really three major forms. The most popular is the one that your English translations are translated from, known as the Masoretic text. I don't think that any of us at this point are going to look at that and go, okay, what's the basis of the main text? The Masoretic text is the standard text for the Old Testament, although I would argue it is slowly changing. And what I mean by that is that it is slowly changing from the perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls are now being investigated a lot more than what they were, because there was a time where these things were being collected and there was just a handful of scholars actually spending time in these texts. Now there's actually transmissions of them, translations of them, looking at them as a collaborative whole, looking at even the Syriac, going into the Septuagint. Now, even within the Septuagint, we have fragmented and text of the Greek recensions, whether you're talking about the Theodotion, whether you're looking at the different aspects of text that go into just sections of the Old Testament or entirety of the Old Testament. We have now multiple ways of looking at the Old Testament, which is actually changing even modern translations in at least a footnote level, but is starting to actually press into the translational level itself. So again, these things are all important, but there are three, and the main one is the Masoretic text. There are two other Greek recensions or stories that contain the book of Esther. The first one is the most popular of the Greek, the Septuagint, which is simply a Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, which sounds simple. It's like, oh, okay, well, I mean, if it's a translation, they're going to be pretty close. A lot of times it is, but not always. The more, even in the Torah, that things were discovered with the Septuagint, where there's majoring differences, say in the book of Deuteronomy, or even in the book of Numbers, you start seeing that it is not isolated in its function. It's like, well, there's no way this came from the Masoretic text. And if it did at places, then it deviated and did its own thing. But now we start looking into, like, say, the Samaritan Pentateuch or even the Syriac. Now we start seeing that there's an alignment that's going on with some of these other translations, which shows that the Masoretic may not be as reliable as people once thought. I didn't say it's not reliable. I'm saying it may not be as reliable as we once thought, because there are older traditions and older translations of the Old Testament, specifically there, the Torah, that actually have agreement against a more modern use of the Masoretic. Now, folks, you may not know this if you're listening and haven't been following this program for a long time, but the Masoretic text is not anything in BC. I mean, when you look at the Masoretic text, it is very New Age. It is AD, after the churches were fully established and moving with transmitted translations and text of the Old Testament and quoting them regularly. And I don't think anybody would even argue that the standard text for the New Testament church was the Septuagint. Whether you think they used the best or the second best or the third best or whatever, that was the standard translation for the Greek churches because they didn't know Hebrew. So it makes perfect sense that they would use the Septuagint. But the Masoretic text is a compilation that came much, much later, finishing 8th, 9th century AD. I mean, when you look at it, it took time to compile what became known as the Masoretic text. And they sought to preserve Hebrew identity within the Old Testament, which I am totally fine with. I don't think anybody's upset about that. But we have to remember, we don't know what manuscripts they were using. We don't know the date and age of those manuscripts. They're very likely to be really good. They're very likely to be based on older tradition, but we have no way to definitively say that is the truth. And so by that, we have to keep in mind that places in the Old Testament where the Septuagint differs, it may be wrong in the Septuagint, but it also may be preserving a much older reading. And the Dead Sea Scrolls has helped us in many, many ways to see a correspondence of a similar reading between Hebrew and the Septuagint that is not found in the preservation and tradition of the Masoretic text. With that being said, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not help us here. The reason the Dead Sea Scrolls do not help us here is because they don't have a copy, at least not found and probably not going to, of the Book of Esther. Purim was not necessarily identified and practiced in that community on Qumran. So we don't really get much help here. Honestly, if the Dead Sea Scrolls had a recension of Esther, it might clear a lot of this up, but they don't at this point, and I don't think we'll ever find at that point a Hebrew version of Esther found in the caves. But there is a third recension. It is also in Greek. It is known as the A text, or referred to as the Lucianic recension. Now, this version, in my opinion, is clearly a redaction of the first and the greater text of the Greek, which is known as the B text. And I don't think it's even worth considering as viable. It is a little bit shorter, and it's clearly, in my opinion, borrowing from or using as a redaction the B text, which is the main one that we're going to spend our time talking about. But when we talk about the canonicity of Esther, for example, there's some strong views. And I think this caused confusion for the reformers more than anybody. I have a statement here from Martin Luther. Even though he included Esther in the German Bible, and I want to be clear about that, he did include Esther in the German Bible. He had this to say about it as well. He said, "I am so great an enemy to," and then he continues on, "Esther, that I wish it had not come to us at all, for it has too many heathen unnaturalities." Okay. When I look at this, I instantly go, Luther is already a problem for canon. And I've said this before, and I've gotten a lot of heat for this, but I mean, you can give back criticism to our program, to our host, to myself. We're totally fine with that. We're not afraid with this, but somebody has to continue to come up with a better explanation when I say this. The Protestant Reformation did more damage to canonicity than anything the Roman Catholic Church has ever done. Starting with Martin Luther, and he's not the only one. I'm going to read another quote from another famous reformer about Esther that caused problems too. But when we talk about canon, what was not doubted for 1,000+ years became doubted because of one man or two men. He later says in a letter, speaking to Erasmus, because remember, Luther used Erasmus's text to translate the Martin Luther German Bible. He said this, "It deserves to be regarded as non-canonical." So I look at that and say, all right, he translated it, he went with it, just like he did some of his other books, like James or Hebrews or Revelation. But he clearly didn't believe it was canon. He even goes so far as to say that he wishes it never came to us. That's pretty peculiar. Now, later on, we see from another famous reformer, John Calvin, he did not include it in the book in his biblical commentaries and only referenced it once in his entire Institutes. So I look at Calvin, I look at Luther, and I think to myself, why did they have such disregard for this? Well, it is a problematic passage, but it's not the only one, because at what point do we start doing this? These are things I want to get into in the canon moving forward. I want to talk about Bel and the Dragon. I want to talk about the story of Susanna. I want to look at these longer recensions of Daniel and look at these longer recensions and even talk about sections in Jeremiah that differ in the Septuagint, talking about the 151st Psalm. I want to spend the next little bit of time with us as an audience, focusing primarily on canonical issues as they relate to the Old Testament, not necessarily the book as a whole. We've done a few of those, but specifically recensions or longer recensions that are found within the Greek traditions as opposed to maybe the Hebrew, being Esther, in my opinion, one of the biggest ones that are out there. Now, the question that has to be asked in regard to moving into the canonical side of this that needs to be pushed and answered, in my opinion, by Dr. Kruger, can a book be canonical without any mention of God? Maybe you didn't know this, but some of you were taught this growing up, that the Hebrew version of Esther does not contain the name of God or Lord in any way, shape, or form. There is no mention of God anywhere in the book of Esther. Some could say that he is the unspoken of power behind the story, because they do fast. They fast in the Hebrew, but there's no call to God. There's no intervention of God. There's no proclamation of God. There's no necessity of God. Any pagan could take that argument of, well, he is the unnamed hero behind the scenes line. Any pagan could give homage to their god or gods being behind the very rescuing of the Jewish people. Now, somebody could push back and say, yeah, but it's the Jews. They only served Yahweh. Did they? I've heard that argument push back on me like, well, it's the Jews. Of course it would be Yahweh. But if a Jew wrote it, we know at a time that Jews became very paganized, especially when they were taken to Babylon and Persia. They became very acquainted with many of the foreign gods, much less the rest of their history, folks, coming out of Egypt to their time of the kings and judges, all the way down to the very Babylonian captivity. I don't think that argument is sufficient to defend its canonicity and its status. Now, we could throw a bunch of presuppositions on this. We can do all that we want here, but one of the criteria that is often given for a theopneustos, God-breathed book, is that it must contain the character and influence of God. And I don't believe in the Hebrew recension we can find that thoroughly. Again, there's arguments that go in place. There's arguments that take place that are sufficient, but not enough to prove. They may be theorized, but not provable. We're looking for sufficient evidence. I don't have to go very far and read the book of Genesis and say God's all in it. I don't have to go very far in the book of Daniel and say that God is all in it, because Daniel's really more comparable to the timeline of Esther or even Ezra or Nehemiah. I don't think anybody can really go through those books that are really similar in timeline from the prophet Jeremiah all the way to Zechariah and say, you know, I just don't see the involvement of God, the passion of God, the character of God, and the influence of God in any of this. If it is God-breathed, would God not have included himself in the text? That is a question that you need to consider in your mind. Now, if you look at the Septuagint form of Esther, the longer recension, based predominantly out of text B, here's a quote, if I'm going to read it to you, about whether or not you think this defines the character and activity of God in the Greek recension of the Septuagint. Remember, O Lord, make yourself known in the time of our affliction and give boldness, O King of the nations, Lord of all power. Give me eloquent speech in my mouth before the king. Turn his heart to hate him that fights against us, so that there may be an end of him and of all that are like-minded to him. But deliver us with your hand and help me, for I am desperate and have no other help but you. Now, that is a quote right before Esther is about to approach the king and ask the Lord to change the king's heart. That one line alone, that's just one example in the Greek Septuagint. There's far more, especially Mordecai's prayer. But this is one of the parts of Esther's prayer. God's character is all in it. Asking him to get involved in their affliction, giving his people boldness, specifically her, turning hearts, turning the situation against itself, asking for deliverance by his mighty hand, helping in time of need. This is more of what we see in the involvement of God in this timeline. Say the book of Nehemiah, say the book of Ezra, say the book of Zechariah. This is the kind of thing you would expect to see. Now, in the Greek version, the focus is completely placed on the Lord and his ability to rescue his people through this woman who fears him, Esther. The Greek version even concludes all through it more affirmation of this very truth, especially through Mordecai. For example, God has done these things. That's from the word of Mordecai, not in the Hebrew, in the Greek. When looking at the result of the prayer of Esther, here's Mordecai's words. God has done these things. There's no dispute as to who did it. This is a major emphasis that is missing in the Hebrew version outside of the reference of Esther telling the Jews to fast for her in Esther 4:16. That's it. So again, we find ourselves in an interesting predicament. Esther is in a prayer. She is bringing God into the equation by name and by character. Mordecai looks back at the work of God through all this, sees the answered prayer, and concludes God has done these great things. If you read the Hebrew recension, one could argue that it is actually Esther's wisdom that gave her the ability to rescue the people. And although it was, but now we see through the Greek version, she was asking for wisdom she didn't have. She was asking for boldness she didn't have. So it was actually God who gave it to her, not something she conjured up within herself, and it's left ambiguous more so in the Hebrew recension. It also should be noted that the Hebrew and Greek versions do not contradict each other. I want to specify this too. But the Greek version is 107 verses longer and contains more information, including 20 references to the Lord, over 20 references to God, and 4 references to prayer. Now, as I stated earlier, in the Hebrew version, there are 0 references to God, 0 references to the Lord, and 0 references to his intercession of prayer outside of requests to fast. But fasting doesn't always imply praying to God either, although it can, but it did not explicitly say as much. There are also 6 additional sections or spreads throughout the narrative in the Greek version of Esther that are not in the Hebrew. There's edition A, which is the prologue. This is Mordecai's dream. We don't see this in the Hebrew as well. Later on, there's another edition. They call it edition B. That's from after chapter 3, verses 13, if you're looking in the Hebrew. And it has the edict against the Jews, which is not disclosed in the actual Hebrew section. Then you have edition C, which comes in after chapter 4, verse 17 in the Hebrew. And this is the prayers of both Mordecai and Esther, which are not at all contained. I just read sections of them to you. Now, after that section, there's Esther's appearance to the king with additional information. This is known as edition D in that section. Then, after chapter 8, verse 12 in the Hebrew, you have edition E. This involves the contents of the edict on behalf of the Jews, rather than against the Jews that we see in edict B. So edict E has content of the edict on behalf of rather than against. Again, we don't have that edict in the Hebrew recension. Then there's that 5th section or that 6th section there, edition F. That's 6 sections total. And that comes after chapter 10, verse 3. And there's an interpretation of the dream that Mordecai had earlier in edition A, the prologue, of course, naturally is not in the Hebrew as well. So again, one can conclude with pretty good evidence, in my opinion, that the Hebrew version of Esther expresses no divine attribute of God or involvement, but it is absolutely clear that the Greek recension does. So when we ask the question, can a book be canonical without any mention of God or involvement of God? I would say no. I don't think so. Also, which version of Esther did the early church use? I think this is a very important point as well. It is impossible to assume that every church in the world used the same version because we even have different recensions in Greek, like I mentioned. But in reality, many of the early churches did utilize the Septuagint. So that's not hard to imagine in of itself. I've demonstrated in multiple places where guys like Clement of Rome, early writings like the Didache, Ignatius, Polycarp, all of them are using the Septuagint when they quote the Old Testament. I've demonstrated a lot in that. Ignatius, who is a part of quoting both Old and New Testament passages, a disciple of John. He's using the Septuagint. Clement, disciple of Peter and Paul, definitely using the Septuagint. Polycarp, a disciple of John, using the Septuagint. Didache, disciples of the apostles, possibly even some of the apostles still living, clearly using the Septuagint. And not only the Septuagint, but the deuterocanonical books that are in the Septuagint, like Sirach, like Tobit, like Judith. We start seeing that actually show up even in their writings in the late 1st century into the early 2nd century. Justin Martyr used Septuagint. Irenaeus used Septuagint. We see this spread out down all the way to the times of Athanasius. Now, given the fact that most churches in the world were Gentiles, we should expect them to use the Greek Septuagint. I'm not saying differently. But when we get into, say, the time of Jerome, who did understand Hebrew, who did a translation into what became the Latin Vulgate, if one were to visit one of the main churches of Rome around, say, the year 100, say the year 90 to 100, and they were to go and listen to Clement of Rome, who I love dearly. Clement of Rome, one of the first early bishops trained by Peter and Paul, if you were to sit there and listen to a sermon and he was referencing or reading from the Old Testament, what recension of Esther do you think he would read from? Well, we don't have to imagine this too much because Clement, being possibly the 3rd bishop of Rome, was trained by the apostles and from their text. Now, you don't have to imagine this much because I actually demonstrated in my doctoral work, specifically in my dissertation, when you look at Clement's understanding and usage of the Old Testament, he uses sections like Judith and Esther. Now, he doesn't quote directly from Esther, but he references something she did that is not in the Hebrew recension. It is rather in the Greek Septuagint. So clearly, when Clement was referencing back to the Book of Esther, he had in mind what's in the Septuagint. So I will add this. I will leave this here. If you're in the 1st century, you're in the late 1st century, you're in Rome, and the 3rd bishop of Rome, trained by Peter and Paul, were preaching or teaching from the Book of Esther, you would expect to see he's using the Greek Septuagint version, the longer recension. Now, when you get into Jerome, he examined the problem when conducting his work on the Latin Vulgate. I mentioned all the way to the time of Jerome. He commissioned teams to go through the world. He commissioned to study different readings, dilemmas posed by the manuscript traditions. Now, what ended up happening is Jerome rejected the Greek version as canonical and translated the Vulgate from the Hebrew. Now, that's important. It should not be ignored. Now, he observed their authenticity as divinely inspired scriptures, and he really relegated them to the end of the translation. So he didn't remove them. He just separated them from the section. So he did not see them. He observed that these were not equivalent to scripture in the Hebrew text, but they're important. He didn't throw them out. Now, I'm not saying that Jerome's right or wrong. I'm saying that he did not reject them to the point where he didn't include them at all in the Vulgate, and he also did not include them at the end or in their sections of the Hebrew text as you see them found in the Septuagint. So he was not a for or against kind of guy, but it would appear that he didn't accept them as equal canon to the rest of the Hebrew text, and that's based on his discussion. Now, Jerome's decision should not be rejected as invalid. As I said, after all, he researched most of these issues from the churches, dealt with the Jews, asked about what they were using. But he did place the Greek version at the end of the translation and did not disregard it altogether. Now, is there any external data that helps with the discussion? Well, I think so. I think we should consider a few things about the Hebrew version of Esther. As of today, the earliest manuscript evidence of Esther we have is roughly 10th century. Now, I'm going to say that again while tapping the mic to make sure you can hear me. 10th century AD in the Masoretic text. That's the earliest we have in the Hebrew. Now, two things should be noted, really, honestly. We should note two things when examining this. First, the Masorenes or the Masoretes, when you look at them, they were obviously following a tradition that preceded the 10th century. We understand that. I hope you understand that. It was likely a text similar to the one that Jerome was examining. So I'm not saying that's the time it came into existence. I'm saying that's the earliest copy that we have. They were clearly using something older. Jerome clearly had something older. So to get the text right, that shouldn't be ignored. These guys were dedicated to following their tradition, and it was certainly earlier than the time they did it. Now, according to Cohen, these schools developed prestige for the Nazarenes, and they worked hard. They were very thorough. They would go back over their work. They would redo their work. So again, that's one. Two, again, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not have the Book of Esther. That kind of leaves us in limbo here. But the Qumran community was also strict. But it suggested that Purim was not found in their communities or practiced in their communities. Now, one of the major arguments that should be considered in the age of the Septuagint, as opposed to the Hebrew text, is when the 70 or so translators were translating Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. This was really around the 2nd century BC. There's a lot of time that goes by between this. So again, there's a lot happening there. But you do have older versions and recensions in Greek, far older than what we even see at the time of Jerome. 2nd century BC, 1st century AD, 2nd century AD. We have manuscripts 2nd, 3rd century AD. All of that is still earlier than Jerome. Now, there's externals that help and don't help. So there's not a lot I can really say there that's going to give us any more than what we already have. But is there anything inside the text? Is there internal data that helps the discussion? Well, I think there are two internal arguments to consider on the subject. Two, the historical name of the king and the nationality of Haman. So first, let's examine the name of the king. According to the Hebrew version, Ahasuerus was the name of the king, whereas he is called Artaxerxes in the Septuagint. So the Greek version is actually supported by classical sources such as Josephus, Esther Rabbah, the Jewish commentary, and Bar Hebraeus. All identify Ahasuerus as either Artaxerxes I, which is between 465 and 424, or Artaxerxes II, which is between 404 and 358 BC. So we already see the term, the name of accuracy when you look at the Hebrew and the Greek. Even people like Josephus or even early Jewish commentaries are demonstrating the name Artaxerxes, whether it be the first or the second in the family line. The second is the name Haman. He's known in the Hebrew version as the descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. You can find that in Esther 3:1. The Septuagint represents Haman as the son of Amadathes, the Bugaon. Now, it's possible that Bugaon could be seen as an adjective or even a substantive use of the term to reproach, or that it's a unique situation describing him or his characteristic, which would make sense. It could be that it's something talking about his attitude toward the Jews and his disposition. But it is unique to the Greek version of Esther, and there are no known people referred to as that. So it could be that that's just a description or an adjective, a part of his name. So the term could be considered descriptive more than an actual people group. Now, later in the Septuagint, Haman is referred to as a Macedonian. If you're looking at the Septuagint, you'll find that in Esther 9:24. So it becomes difficult to assess which perspective makes more sense of the narrative. It could be assumed that he's a descendant of Agag that you see, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter number 15, where Saul was supposed to kill all the Agagites. That's part of it. But there are good arguments for different perspectives about Haman. But the major question should be asked in this section is the name of the king. Did the Hebrew text get it wrong in comparison to Josephus or Esther Rabbah, the Jewish commentary? Which one is right? The Septuagint, the Hebrew? It seems like the Septuagint is actually an older tradition, aligning with historians and commentaries. That to me is the greater question. So kind of in conclusion, our goal in this is to investigate the evidence and follow it all the way to the end of the truth. And then when we find the truth, we just embrace it. In discussions like this, I believe it's completely unwise to be dogmatic. I think it's unwise to make a definitive statement and leave it in that form. If one were to accept the Greek version of the Book of Esther by default, you are accepting the Hebrew, because everything in the Hebrew is actually in the Greek. It's just not true the other way around. So yeah, I'm fine with accepting the Greek Septuagint, because in doing so, you're accepting the Hebrew text too, because all that's in the Hebrew text can be pretty much found in the Septuagint. But what if you're wrong on the Hebrew side? What if you're wrong in investigating the Hebrew text? What if there is a longer version? What if the early church fathers that quote from it are correct and they're using the right one? Here's my advice. Even if you land with the Hebrew over the Greek, I would advise you to read the Greek just for its historicity, just because it actually helps with the context. It'll actually bring to light things that may not make sense in the Hebrew, like the transition of narrative. What if it's just simply commentary, ancient commentary of the surrounding scenery that helps readers understand what's going on more? If that's all it is, then all of us should read it. My personal preference and my personal opinion, I think we should be using the longer recension. I think we should be using the one that we find in the Septuagint that is formed from predominantly text B. That's my personal opinion. And by doing that, I'm accepting the Hebrew too, because it's all found within it. But at worst, if it is not the correct one, it is wrong, or just some ancient commentary, then just that alone should cause us to actually want to read it, because it'll help us understand, even if you use it as an ancient commentary. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. If this is your first time listening in and you enjoy content like this, please make sure you hit the like and subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast version, we also ask that you go and follow us so that when new episodes come out, you get notified and you can listen to them instantly. We typically release them somewhere between Monday night and Tuesday night on each episode. Also, there is a link in the description. If you are enjoying what you get from Facts, you can partner with us, give even as simple as a $5 to $10 donation a month. It'll allow you to be a part of a bi-monthly newsletter and also discussions with our team. We're going to personalize question and answer time and even ideas to help move forward this program. You can hit that link there. It'll automatically give us your email to put you on the line to give out the newsletter and things like that. So we'll have your information there. Also to go a long way in building things. There will also be a link in here to the Greek Esther that I will have available for you. If you'd like to read that, you have never read it before, it'll be in the link description as well. Make sure you click that, read through that, and I think you'll enjoy it and you'll actually be blessed. Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. Grace and peace to you. God bless.